My wife's grandmother, actually, she just passed away last year, and she was 102 years old. She was born here in San Pedro. Her maiden name was Caserma, and which is an old San Pedro family. Her father was a fisherman that came from Ischia and moved here to San Pedro like the rest of the Ischkiatans here. And what he would do is every time he went fishing, he would come back and save a little money and buy a house. And after a while, he owned most of the 9th Street from about Gaffey to Pacific. And she was actually born on 9th Street herself at the location where the Harbor Interfaith building currently stands. In fact, I think it was the family that sold it to Harbor Interfaith to build that facility. But she was in the first graduating class at Dana Junior High, but she never made it past Dana because her father being fishing all the time, her mother became ill, and she had to stay back and take care of her mother, so she never went on to San Pedro High School. However, she met her husband, who was in the Pacific Fleet. He was in the Navy, and the Pacific Fleet was stationed here in San Pedro at that time. But then slightly after that, the Pacific Fleet moved to Pearl Harbor. And on the day of December 7th, 1941, she was playing the radio for her daughter, which would be my mother-in-law, for her daughter and her son, and the bombing of the attack on Pearl Harbor came over the radio. And so she was quite shocked about that and was quite worried because obviously her husband was at Pearl Harbor. And so she listened and listened on the radio and finally heard that his ship, the West Virginia, was sunk. And so she was expecting perhaps the worst, and the worst did come. She received a letter several days after saying that he had been killed in action at Pearl Harbor. So she was trying to figure out, how she was going to support these two young children and so forth as a widow, a young widow, because she was quite young at the time. And all of a sudden, about a week or two later, she receives a phone call. And she gets this phone call, and it was her husband on the phone. And, of course, that was rather shocking. And what happened was he was below decks asleep when the attack started. And the Japanese had dropped a torpedo to hit the West Virginia, and he was below decks, and it did hit not far from him, knocked him unconscious. He was a boxer on the ship. They used to have the ship boxing team and so forth. He was a lightweight, and he was laying there unconscious, and the heavyweight boxer on his team saw him, picked him up, went up the ladder, and threw him off the ship. And he woke up when he hit the water. And this scene is actually shown in the movie Pearl Harbor. Once he hit the water, he was able to come ashore. And when he got ashore, he was a chief in the Navy, so he was up kind of high. And they told him, hey, you need to take this ship that is still floating and take it to San Francisco and get it repaired for the war effort. So he got a crew together, and they took it to San Francisco. When he got to San Francisco, he calls his wife, not knowing that they had thought he was dead. It was, obviously a lot of confusion at the time. And so he says, no, I'm quite alive, and why don't you come up and see me? We'll spend New Year's together. And so she went down, hopped on the red car here in San Pedro down on Beacon Street, took the red car up to the train station in L.A. and spent New Year's with him. And the last part of that story is kind of interesting, is that he then went and spent the rest of the war on I think it's the Missouri. And so he was standing at attention on the deck of the Missouri when the Japanese signed the peace treaty. And so he was one of the few people that was at the exact beginning of the war and the end of the war.